You are listening to Chthonia, the podcast of the Dark Feminine. Chthonia's logo was designed by J.R. Malpair. Background music is Phantasm by Kevin MacLeod. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia. I'm your host, Breach Burke, and today we're going to talk about Medusa and her sisters, the Gorgons. In fact, they're all Gorgons, all three of them. And Medusa's quite a popular topic. She, you see her represented a lot in movies, in mythological novels. You see her probably represented in gaming and in artwork in a lot of different places. She's been represented actually long past Greek and Roman civilization. You see her in artwork, throughout all the different periods, through the Renaissance and so forth. There are a lot of representations of Medusa in art. And I think, so there's a tremendous amount of interest in Medusa. When I teach mythology, I usually will provide students with a number of topics that they can choose from in terms of making their, writing their term papers for the course. And inevitably I'll have one on Medusa, and they will always choose that one. That one's a very popular one. I've had classes where 85 to 90% of my students are interested in Medusa. They're interested in Medusa or they're interested in Aphrodite. I mean, it's kind of an interesting dynamic to look at. But Medusa is a fascinating figure, and and again, we're talking about artwork, but also in literature too. She represented a lot in poetry, and in there's other kinds of adaptations of her story. That sort of look at the different nuances of her. She's been used as a symbol for different things over time, having to do with women and women's issues. And so I think it's important first, again, we talked about the Erinyes last week, or 2 weeks ago, and it's important to recognize the way, one of the things that, a pattern you might notice is that these goddesses or these beings start out as one thing initially in mythology, and they kind of later morph into something else that's quite different. And the same is also true of Medusa. Now, first of all, let's talk about who the Gorgons are. Okay, now Medusa is one of three Gorgon sisters. Okay, Steno, Euryale, and Medusa. They're the three of them. Medusa is unique in that she is actually mortal. Okay, she actually and mortal, by definition, means you're capable of death. You can die. The root word is mort, which is the word for death. And so if you're immortal, therefore you are immune to death. And the Gorgons are actually sea monsters. Okay, they are the children of Phorcys and Ceto, who are sea monsters, and they are therefore creatures of the sea. Actually, the name Euryale actually has to do with brine or brininess, which has to do with the sea foam or the foaminess of the churning of the sea. I'd like to give a full description of the Gorgons. I have here Pierre Grimal's Dictionary of Mythology that Penguin puts out. It's actually quite a good one. And let's see, I just want to find the Gorgons. Here we are. Okay. So this is Pierre Grimal that I'm quoting from here. There were three Gorgons called Steno, Euryale, and Medusa, all daughters of Phorcys and Ceto. Medusa was mortal, the other two were immortal. The name Gorgon was generally applied to Medusa, who was particularly considered as the Gorgon. They lived in the far west, okay? I'm just going to stop here and mention that the west, along with caves, deserts, the sea, other things, were often associated with the underworld, okay? So they were creatures of the west. They were creatures of the land of death. Their heads were entwined with snakes, and their necks were protected by dragon scales. They had huge tusks like those of a boar, hands of bronze, and golden wings. Their gaze was so penetrating that anyone who encountered it was turned to stone. Poseidon, who is the god of the sea, alone was not afraid of them, for he had coupled with Medusa and fathered a child. Actually, he fathered two children with Medusa. We'll talk about them in a minute. He mentions the death of Medusa having to do with Perseus, which we'll talk about again in a moment. From the stump of Medusa's neck, because of course she's beheaded, two beings sired by Poseidon issued forth: Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor. Chrysaor is generally represented as a man who is born carrying a golden sword. And again, we'll talk about what that means in a second. Athena fixed Medusa's head to her shield, or the center of her aegis. That's an aegis, of course, another word for shield. In this way, she could turn her enemies to stone. Perseus also gathered up the blood that flowed from the wound, for it had magic properties. The blood which flowed from the vein on the left was a mortal poison. That's interesting. Now, the left and right dynamic as well. The left becomes the sinistra in Latin. We associate that with the sinister. So just like we have these dichotomies of good and evil and so forth, you have the dichotomy of left and right, and left is always considered to be sort of the, when we talk about Satanism, we talk about the left-hand path. There's this sort of the association with it that's darker. But that which flowed from the right was a remedy capable of restoring life. Okay, so Medusa's blood can either kill you or can make you live. Interesting. Think about this is actually something to consider. Furthermore, a single lock of her hair, when held up in the face of an attacking army, would put the enemy to flight. By the Hellenistic era, the legend of Medusa had evolved considerably. At the start, the Gorgon was a monster which belonged to the pre-Olympian generation. Then she came to be considered as the victim of a metamorphosis. Okay, this is back to Ovid. It was said that the Gorgon had originally been a beautiful girl who had dared to set her beauty against that of Athena. She was especially proud of her beautiful hair. So to punish her, Athena changed her hair into a mass of snakes. In other versions, Athena unleashed her wrath against the girl because Poseidon had ravished her in a temple sacred to the goddess. Medusa had to suffer punishment for this sacrilege. Okay, so what we're looking at here are really three different stories. We have an original story, which is, in a sense, we can call Medusa a goddess, although not, technically she's mortal, so she's kind of not a goddess. She's more like just a sea monster. But she's actually kind of on the level of a Titan. She's pre-Olympian, okay? The Olympians are born from Cronus and Rhea, and so they are, for the most part. So they are children of the Titans. And these two, Phorcus and Cato, are monsters that come from the sea. So they are considered to be kind of, at the very least, they're sort of contemporaries of the Olympians, if not pre-Olympian. Okay, and it's interesting how we see a story here that kind of moves through these different versions. And I want to talk a little bit about the three kind of key themes that appear, that the Medusa myth actually brings up. But before I do that, I think what I would like to do is talk about the story of Perseus and Medusa, because that is the one that that's the one that people, that is the one that is typically associated with her. And is the most famous one. Okay, so I'm gonna read you that story also from Grimal, because it's a well summarized version here. Okay, so Perseus is the son of Zeus and Danae. Okay, Zeus visits Danae as a shower of gold. Okay, her father Acrisius does not want her. He's very jealously guards her. He's sort of the there's this mythological motif of the jealous father or uncle, the wicked father or uncle. And when it comes to young women, it often becomes that they're not going to let them. They're going to try to keep them virgins. But Zeus, of course, gets her pregnant. And she at first, he says here, Danae contrived to bear Perseus secretly and to keep him in secret for several months. One day, however, the child gave a cry which was heard by Acrisius. Unwilling to believe that his daughter had been seduced by Zeus, Acrisius killed Danae's nurse as an accomplice and had his daughter and grandson thrown into the sea in a wooden chest. The chest was cast upon the island of Serapos, where mother and child were taken in by a fisherman named Dictys, brother of the tyrant Polydictes. Now, one thing to remember here is that in the sort of, we're back to Joseph Campbell for a minute, but his little sort of myth of the hero. Again, for whatever faults there are in some of Campbell's thinking about this, it is certainly true that the hero myth often starts with the child being a threat to some person, usually, somebody who he's rival for the kingship or something. There's some kind of a threat. And so they're either sent away, they're cast away, or they... and oftentimes they are sent down a river or into the sea in a chest, which in some ways is reminiscent of the flood myths, where all of them, they climb into a chest and are carried to safety along the sea. But he is, and of course then they end up living sort of, landing somewhere and living an idyllic childhood, usually among shepherds. So this kind of follows the pattern, okay? So Dictys welcomed them and raised the young Perseus, who became a handsome and courageous young man. Polydectes conceived a passion for Danae, but Perseus guarded his mother well, and the king did not dare resort to violence. One day Polydectes invited his friends, including Perseus, to dinner, and asked what gift each was willing to offer him. All other guests said that a horse was a fitting gift, but Perseus declared that he would bring him the head of the Gorgon Medusa. I'm going to stop Grimal's version here and just note that in some versions, this is actually a plot on Polydectes' part to kill Perseus. So he suggests, and he knows Perseus does not have the money to bring him a gift. So when Perseus says to him, well, I don't know what to bring you, what do you suggest? Then he asks for the head of the Gorgon Medusa, okay? In this version that Grimal tells, the next day all the princes brought Polydectes a horse except for Perseus, who brought nothing. Polydectes then ordered him to fetch Medusa's head, saying that otherwise he would take Danae by force. So, okay, I'm threatening to rape your mother if you don't bring me this. Another version, okay, Polydectes, it says, intended to give all these presents to Hippodamia, whom he intended to marry. In this difficult situation, Perseus was helped by Hermes and Athena. Okay, Hermes being the psychopomp god, the god who crosses boundaries, and also the messenger god, and Athena, of course. On their advice, he went first in search of the Graeae, and Graeae are the old women. These are 3 women who are born old and who are blind and have the gift of prophecy. They're also said to be cannibalistic. But he finds the Graeae, and they eventually showed him the way to the nymphs, who possessed winged sandals, a shoulder bag called Kibisis, and the helmet of Hades, which has made its wearer invisible. Okay, so he has winged sandals, this special shoulder bag. And you find what does he need a shoulder bag for? Well, this is the thing that he can put the head of Medusa in without being affected by it. And of course, with the helmet of invisibility, and he also has a sword. The nymphs gave these objects. Oh, and I should also note that they don't mention here that he also has a shield. The shield is critically important here. The nymphs give these objects to Perseus, while Hermes had armed him with the harpe, a sickle made of adamant. Okay, so there's that. Adamant is like a very, very hard stone. Perseus then set off to look for the Gorgons, Steno, Euryale, and Medusa. Of the 3, only Medusa was mortal, which is why Perseus had some hope of decapitating her. While Medusa was asleep, Perseus rose into the air on his winged sandals, and while Athena held a shield of polished bronze over Medusa, so that it acted as a mirror, he struck off her head. From Medusa's mutilated neck sprang a winged horse, Pegasus, and a giant, Chrysaor. Perseus put the head of Medusa in his shoulder bag and set off home. The victim's 2 sisters pursued him, but to no avail, for Hades' helmet prevented them from seeing him. On the way back, Perseus traveled through Ethiopia, where he came across Andromeda. Yeah, and I like to note to people that it's Ethiopia where he picks up Andromeda. So, so Andromeda is an African princess. Okay. In many, like Clash of the Titans and these others, she represented as this sort of little lily white kind of child, and I'm like, no, she's not. She was being offered as a sacrifice in expiation of the imprudent words spoken by her mother, Cassiopeia, and had been tied to a rock. Okay, she was supposed to be sacrificed to the sea monster. In some versions, the Kraken was supposed to come in and take her away. Now, a lot of sea motifs here. You have Perseus, who's thrown into the sea. You have Andromeda, who's in danger of being sacrificed to the sea. There's some symbolism here as well. So Perseus fell in love with Andromeda and promised her father, Cepheus, that he would release her if he could have her hand in marriage. Okay, and thus, supposedly, when the monster came for Andromeda, Perseus showed him the head of the Gorgon, and then the monster turned to stone, and he was able to rescue Andromeda. The bargain was struck, and Perseus slew the monster. Okay. After his marriage, Perseus returned to Serapos, accompanied by Andromeda. During his absence, Polydectes had tried to rape Danae, who had to seek refuge at the altars of the gods. Perseus took his revenge on Polydectes by turning him to stone. He then handed over the government of Serapos to Dictys. He gave the sandals bag and Hades' helmet to Hermes, who returned them to the nymphs. Athena set the head of Medusa in the middle of her shield. Perseus then left Serapos with Andromeda and set off for his native land, Argos, to see his grandfather, Acrisius. However, Perseus accidentally killed him at Larissa in Thessaly. Not daring to return to Argos in order to claim the kingdom of the man he had killed, he exchanged places with his cousin Megapenthes, who thus became the king of Argos, while Perseus became king of Tiryns. And interestingly, I'm just going to throw this in, even though this doesn't have to do with Medusa, because this will be a future topic. Perseus is said to have successfully opposed the introduction of the cult of Dionysus into Argos, and even to fought the god and drowned him in a lake at Lerna. He's also said to have killed Ariadne, who was among other things, considered to be a spouse of Dionysus. In the same battle, another version gives just Ariadne as Perseus's victim. Mythographers of the Roman period recorded that after Danae and Perseus had been thrown into the sea by Acrisius, they landed not at Serapos, but on the coast of Latium. Yes, of course. That's where Aeneas eventually lands. There, King Polymnus married Danae and with her founded the city of Ardea. Turnus was supposed to be a descendant of this marriage. So this is the way they tie Perseus into Roman mythology. Okay, so we hear the story of Perseus here. And as I mentioned in the earlier story, Medusa is also, Medusa is a couple of different things. And in the story that's told here by Grimal, Medusa is very passive. She's asleep, and Perseus comes and beheads her. Okay, I don't know, and again, there's the importance of the shield. He can't look directly at Medusa, or he will turn to stone himself. So, in some versions, he's holding the shield. This particular one, Athena, is holding the shield for him. And thus he avoids being turned into an object, into stone, through reflection. Okay, through not looking at her directly, not approaching the situation directly. Okay, which is rather interesting. I'm going to mention. I just want to say something quickly about Medusa's children here too. Pegasus, who's the winged horse. Now, horses are associated, as we noted, with Poseidon. And the idea of who is, of course, a water god, and of course this horse with wings kind of adds an air element to the horse. Chrysaor is, like I said, he's portrayed as a man who's born holding a golden sword, and this is often interpreted as Chrysaor as being almost like a sheaf of grain. Okay, he's like a golden. He's like tall and golden. And he also mates with one of the sea monsters and produces, his offspring are Geryon, which is the fiery god that is killed later by Hercules or Heracles. And so you had the children. So you have this sea reference. You have this horse. But you also have a masculine figure who's kind of the representative of the grain that is cut down. Okay, kind of your John Barleycorn kind of thing. So we kind of see this connection. The mating of Medusa and Poseidon creates creatures that are that have an interesting connection to fertility and to nature. Okay. So just having mentioned that, I want to talk a little bit. There's basically, like I said, when I read this story and I think about it in terms of other myths, there's three kind of basic themes that present themselves. Okay, first of all, there's the theme of being turned to stone. Okay, when someone is turned to stone, what does it mean to be turned to stone? That's one theme. The other has to do with Medusa as a water deity. We don't necessarily tend to think of her that way, but her as kind of being connected to the water, as I think I mentioned, water. The underworld is often portrayed as either being under the earth or under the sea. And Poseidon, who is a god of the sea, is also a god of earthquakes and horses. So there's this question of what does it mean to be? Why is it that she is a water deity, so to speak, or a water monster, as it were? There's a lot of, particularly both male and female, but there's a lot of particularly female water deities or water monsters in Greek myth. And then the question becomes, well, what are they and what do they represent? It's also worth mentioning Ovid in his Metamorphoses. There's a lot of examples as well of these beautiful nymphs who, like the later story, beautiful nymphs who are turned into water monsters. And then what does that mean? What is the change in inflection there? What is the understanding? Okay, so that's the second theme. The third theme has to do kind of with that change in role. Okay, why? So she's either shown as an example of hubris against the gods. My hair is more beautiful than your hair. Or she's considered to be a rape victim. Okay, and that's just very interesting in all of these cases. And I want to talk about what that means. I think it plays into a larger theme that I've continually talked about in terms of the changing nature of religion between the ancients and what we think of as religion in the modern world. But I'm going to take each of these themes one at a time rather than kind of give a summary here. Okay, so first let's talk about turning to stone. So what does it mean to turn to stone? There's a couple of possibilities, a couple different ways you can look at this idea of having a woman look at you and turn you to stone. There's one way to look at it. It's the idea of objectification, or of turning someone into an object rather than a subject. Okay, we do this a lot with celebrities, for example. They cease to become real people. They're images. They're objects. They're things that we look at, but they're not an actual person. Okay, so what does it mean for somebody to turn you to stone in that fashion? And in some ways, I kind of see the Medusa story, or the Medusa ability of Medusa, or of the Gorgons in general, to turn people to stone, as a reverse of the story of Pygmalion and Galatea. Not necessarily their original names, by the way, but those are the names that have later been assigned to them. That comes from a story of having to do with the goddess Aphrodite. And Pygmalion is a young man living on Cyprus, which is the island sacred to Aphrodite, and he is a sculptor. And he does not like the women on the island of Cyprus because he thinks they're all loose women. He's very chaste. Okay. And so he sculpts himself a statue of a woman, and he falls in love with the statue of the woman. I mean, to the point that he's bringing it gifts and everything else, and he very much is in love with the image that he has created. But of course, it's just an image. It's just a stone object. So at Aphrodite's annual festival, he goes and he prays to the goddess and asks that if she could make his stone woman real. And in that version of the myth, Aphrodite is rather touched by his request. So he goes home from the festival and then finds the statue is gone, but there's a live woman sitting there who resembles his statue where he had been. And in some versions, she is referred to as Galatea. And I believe that he marries her, and so basically that's the reverse. You have something that's a stone object that now becomes a real person. Medusa may represent the opposite effect, the way in which we may take real people and real feelings and real situations and turn them into something objectified, something that's used as a means to an end, or something that is is only perhaps it's a tool for gratification, perhaps it's a tool for something else, but where somebody is being used as a tool rather than being treated in their own right. And again, we have a female figure that is doing this, but there's this there's this unconscious sense of the way in which a real person can be objectified and used as an object, turned into an object. The other sense of turning to stone connects in with what I'll explore as a second theme, which I'm not entirely getting to yet, but just as they're interrelated. Now, sea monsters typically in mythology, I usually, when I teach this, when I teach this at the university level, usually I have a whole class just on sea deities and sea monsters, because that's a whole genealogy in and of itself. And typically, when we look at it from a psychological view of myth or a psychoanalytical view, sea monsters tend to represent the terrors of the unconscious mind, okay? And so often, that's those sort of monstrous figures that are swimming around in the waters of what Jung would call the collective unconscious. Okay, these sort of scary figures that we often confront when we get past our ego and our persona and our conscious thinking and start exploring what's behind all of that. And Medusa can often represent a paralyzing influence of some kind, either a depression or, in worst cases, a kind of schizophrenic condition. Okay, where the ego is frozen and cannot, and the personality can't shine forth. It's very interesting because if you are anybody who practices or interested in Eastern thinking, Eastern religion, Eastern philosophy, a lot of times we kind of have this idea that anything that has to do with that the ego must be gotten rid of. Okay, there's this the ego is bad. We need to get rid of the ego. And, that's actually, in one sense, it has to do with our attachments to things, because things disappear. I think that's really how it's meant. But really, in the sense that we think of it, really the idea of getting rid of the ego is silly. You can't get rid of the ego. You need an ego in order to be able to function in the world. This is how you connect with the world around you. This is how you connect socially. This is how you function with other people. You have to have some kind of, you can, if you want to recognize it as a game or whatever, you can do that. But you can't do without it, because without it, you're completely unable to connect with the outside world. Now, I want to just read something else too. There was a Jungian psychiatrist called Heinrich Karl Fiers, who practiced, I want to say 1950s, maybe 1960s. And he was also a psychiatrist. He was a medical doctor. He prescribed whatever was available at that time for psychiatric illness, but he also made use of Jungian psychoanalysis in his methods. And he has a book called Jungian Psychiatry. And again, I often quote from this book when I teach as well. And I want to read a little something, because he talks about something called the Medusa effect. And that I think is relevant here in this idea of being turned to stone. Okay. He talks about, he says, psychotherapy must begin with the admission of the patient into a clinic. It is not initially, however, a question of procedure or techniques of treatment, but founded on the attitude of doctor and nursing staff. When the patient first arrives, we hardly know him. We have to get to know this person who is a stranger. He has to be accepted in the community of the clinic, not just into the building, okay? And so they'll talk about, allowing the person to talk. Doctor has to listen. First phase of treatment will last a few days, a few weeks. I'm just kind of running through here. And a few weeks. Over this period, we will get to know the new arrival quite well. It is during this time that what Jung called constellation takes place. Something manifests itself. What manifests itself has a bearing on fundamental questions affecting the patient's illness. Psychosis shatters the unity of consciousness and the supremacy of the will. The something that manifests itself in the constellation is the psychic factor, what Jung called a complex, that has created a disturbed state of consciousness by disrupting the order of consciousness. As a result, the patient suffers a loss of freedom that frequently corresponds in legal terms to diminished responsibility. So he talks about how constellated contents are extremely varied, but one constantly comes across single motifs that recur in different cases. Freud emphasized the frequency of the Oedipus motif. Subsequently, Jung turned his particular attention to the study of such motifs. Okay, this is where we get the idea of archetypes. But there are also motifs. And he says, by way of example, I would like to consider the psychological finding that Jung called the Medusa. The Medusa has mythological and biological aspects. In mythology, she is the mortal among the three daughters of Phorcys known as the Gorgons. She has snakes for hair. Anyone who looks at her is turned to stone, etc., etc. Okay? In context of biology, a Medusa is a sea creature with neither shell nor backbone. It belongs to the group of, I'm not going to say this right, nematophores, I think is how you say that, and has tentacles containing poisonous stinging capsules. It uses the poison to kill its prey. The biological aspect of the Medusa is further represented in patient's material by other sea creatures of a lower order that are related in form, such as the cephalopods, for example an octopus, armed with tentacles, or the predatory starfish equipped with mobile arms. He says, I will now give a few clinical examples of this mythological and biological motif. In each case, the pressure is very considerable effect was involved, which so altered the patient's behavior that hospitalization was ordered. This does not necessarily imply a diagnosis of psychosis in the narrower sense of the term. Okay, so the first case, he mentions a 26-year-old student. For some time, he had been making observations about himself, which he carefully noted down. He met a girl and established a friendly relationship with her, but then came into conflict with her, with the result that she wanted to detach herself from him. The student was agitated and at a loss. He consulted a psychiatrist, but found no real rapport. Shortly after, he had an argument with a fellow student whom he suspected of having a relationship with his former girlfriend. The fellow student then got in touch with his patient's parents. At home, letters had already come to light in which the patient explained that he felt inwardly wrecked. He was judged to be a danger to himself and was admitted to the clinic. In the clinic, the patient was outwardly calm, though he admitted a certain suicidal leaning. Occasionally nervous tachycardias indicated affective tension. In a detailed written self-portrait, he described the lost girlfriend as a Medusa. When she left him, he had turned to stone. That was the Medusa effect, the panic. He maintained that as a consequence of his inability to develop and sustain the relationship with his girlfriend, he had turned to stone for good. This is why for him she was a Medusa, and why the effect she had on him was the Medusa effect. Okay, so that's case one. Case two, a 27-year-old man, also a student, fails his exams. Subsequently, he becomes increasingly convinced of his political importance, feels himself surrounded by spies, and is certified on grounds of paranoid symptoms. In the clinic, his condition becomes acutely catatonic after a few weeks. The patient believes his bed is on fire, feels burned all over, and has to be put in a cell. There he is frightened and agitated. What particularly horrifies him is from the ceiling above his head hangs a giant octopus with alarming tentacles. He says he needs a doctor urgently, one who is half doctor, half veterinarian. I have observed the image of the Medusa, the boneless tentacled sea monster, not only in intellectual formulations or hallucinations, but in some cases in pictures patients drew. And he offers examples in the book. Hopefully I can show you these pictures on YouTube if I can get an image of them. When I've tried to scan them from this book, they look pretty lousy. So if I can, I will try to supplement with that. If not, if I can't end up doing it for this particular podcast, probably on one of my podcast pages, Instagram and Facebook and some of the other places, Twitter, I'll try to have those pictures after the podcast is posted. Okay, case 3, a 19-year-old youth undergoing clinical treatment on account of an extremely undisciplined and dissipated behavior. After some time, an attempt is made to transfer the patient to an open ward. However, he very rapidly becomes maniacally distracted and finally so disassociated that he has to be transferred back to the closed clinical section. There to occupy himself, he begins to draw. What he paints is an inferno, an underworld. The center of the underworld is ruled by a giant tentacled sea monster. Okay. Case 4, a 48-year-old woman married for years began suffering from depressive moods. Very gradually, her state becomes manic and restless, eventually to a worrying degree. This leads to her being hospitalized. In the clinic, within only a few days, she gets into a state of considerable agitation. To calm and distract her attention, a nurse allows her to draw. She draws an octopus with tentacles. Below the pictures are the word "the octopus," the depths. Okay? Now, he goes on. He's got several other cases like this. And I mention them because, again, this idea of disassociation, this being turned to stone, either through a shock, a trauma, a depressive condition, something that causes the person to disconnect with reality, is associated with this tentacled sea monster. Okay, very interesting. And these are people who were not. I wouldn't necessarily call them students of mythology. These are clinical psychiatric cases. From different walks of life and with different kinds of, some with similar issues, but some with different ones, okay? And we see everything from kind of a paranoid schizophrenia to, suicidal depression being linked to this idea of being turned to stone, okay? There's definitely a loss of energy and action associated with it. And in some cases, it's interesting how, again, that connection between the underworld and the sea, they see it as being in some kind of a fiery inferno or some kind of underworld place. Okay, so related to that, then I think we should kind of segue into the Medusa as sea monster, okay, and Gorgons as sea monsters. Monstrous feminine as a sea creature is actually pretty common, and in psychoanalytic thinking, that devouring and overwhelming influence of the ocean, that sort of ocean of the collective unconscious, that sort of ends up becoming a metaphor for it. It's like the ocean, and the ocean is full of all kinds of creatures. We think of stories of being in the belly of the whale or being swallowed. That's another example of this. And again, we've talked about how that unconscious is often represented as feminine, and so this becomes a motif of the devouring feminine. Okay, and again, part of the hero's journey is that the hero has to go and he's either swallowed by the beast and then has to be disgorged in some way and then kills the beast. We certainly have ideas of the female serpent at the beginning of the world. Again, like Tiamat, for example, comes to mind in Babylonian mythology. She's the great serpent that Marduk battles, and then when he kills her, her body becomes the firmament of the earth. There are also references to Leviathan in the Bible, the great serpent that will be cut up and fed at the feast of the second coming. There's definitely this connection between the serpent and life. Now, of course, and I've kind of so the female serpent as the foundation of the world, really, which is both creative and which energizes us, but also can stultify us, can stop us, can devour us. As I mentioned, many goddesses in Greek mythology, have these very positive aspects. ones that have to do with, nurturing, creation, childbirth, but they're also goddesses of the violent death of children. There's this kind of, you're seeing this more complicated aspect of the feminine where it's all of those things at the same time. And Medusa tends to represent this life force. When this life force is immobilized, if you think about Kundalini again in Eastern thought, and the way in which the Shakti force can be either mobilizing or paralyzing, when it's properly mobilized, the idea of the serpent that comes up through the spine, and it's often said, one of the things I've often said about Kundalini yoga, I know that I've heard this a lot, particularly among certain Catholic Church and other places where they say, oh, you shouldn't practice yoga if you're a Christian. And again, I've often said, when it comes to hatha yoga and things like that, there's no reason you can't go to a yoga class and stretch your body out. I mean, that's just silliness. However, I do sort of agree with them when it comes to other deeper practices like Kundalini yoga. If you're not properly taught by somebody, you do run the risk of getting into paralyzing mental situations because the life force can get that force that moves up through the spinal column can be can get stuck, it can get stilted, things can happen. And if you don't have someone who can help you fix those things, you can descend into mental illness and into other things. So that's why, some certain types of, yoga, when I see people just, trying to do it from a book, I'm kind of like, when you're playing, that's kind of like playing around with electricity. It's a very good thing, but you still don't want to stick your finger in an electrical socket. You could end up with a real shock force there. So, so I kind of think of that also as kind of Medusa as representing the sort of blocked Kundalini energy that's stopped, it's turned to stone. Okay, so that's another possible way to think about it. Now, so we see, so she represents, Medusa and her sisters have to do with the sea and what is under the sea, okay, and they are connected to Poseidon. Poseidon is the only one, as Grimal mentions, who will mate with them or be involved with them. I think. And so again, the idea of the sea serpent or monster, we can take it in the broadest sense as, some kind of terrifying feminine that we might encounter, if we are, attempting to explore the world, say, of our dream states, or if we are undergoing some kind of psychological trauma, we might encounter these fears, or even if it's just general day-to-day stress and anxiety and fear about things, can be represented as these monstrous creatures, especially if these fears allow us to, stultify us. They keep us from moving ahead. Now, so that kind of brings me, though, to the change in the perception of this kind of water creature, okay, who doesn't merely represent these aspects of unconsciousness, or these aspects that need to be grappled with or dealt with in some way. And again, Perseus really does show the way to deal with it, because rather than directly, he deals with it through reflection. I remember having one of my professors in grad school talk about, the idea that reflection is the way, stopping and thinking rather than, simply diving into something that is dangerous. There's you don't look directly at the thing that can turn you to stone. You only look at it by inflection or by reflection. One does not approach the archetypes directly. One approaches them through dreams, through images, through indirect things. You don't approach it directly. Okay, even people who engage in magical practice, where they might deal with certain energies, even that tends to be kind of more of an indirect. I suppose there could be a direct possession in some cases, but a lot of times people are doing it indirectly. They use black mirrors, they use cauldrons, they use other things to bring about those images rather than necessarily dealing with them directly. Okay. Now, I think one of the things, now again, as we noted, when we get to Ovid and when we get to the Romans, we start to see a change in the Medusa story. And she falls more into the motif of the, sort of the girlfriend of the god thing. And the one, and being put in a position where she commits some kind of hubris against a goddess. Athena, or Minerva would be in the Roman, was a frequently offended, both her and Aphrodite or Venus. were frequently offended by women who felt that they were greater in some way. Arachne is one version, where she's turned into a spider by Athena. But even if they have not offended a goddess, sometimes nymphs who have spurned. There's another being. It could be a centaur. It could be some other kind of earth being that approaches them, and they reject their advances. Sometimes that can lead to, I'm thinking of the case of Scylla, who I believe is his name Glauce? In any case, he's a centaur who falls in love with Medusa, and Scylla she rejects the advances, and so he goes to Circe or Circe, depending on how you like to say it, and the sorceress, and asks her for a potion to make Scylla fall in love with him. But of course, Circe is in love with this centaur, but he's not interested in Circe. He's interested in Scylla. So she gets very angry, and of course, in her jealousy, she poisons the water that Scylla bathes in, and turns her into this horrible monster with multiple heads and barking dogs and things. And so this idea of the beautiful woman who is either haughty, who thinks, who is either rejects somebody or she is haughty, and she now becomes, now she's viewed as this kind of sea monster of some kind. Which is rather interesting. And either that or she falls into the victim thing. I've read an article recently about Medusa as rape victim because of the later story that says that Poseidon ravished her in Athena's temple and that she was a priestess of Athena, in which case there's this idea that Medusa is blameless. And it's similar to the story of Persephone and some of the other ones. There kind of becomes this idea of the rape victim of the god, and whether or not that person is really did this person was this person willingly having sex with the god? Did they not know what they were doing, or was it an innocent thing, or were they taken by force? And so that becomes a rather interesting. That is the interesting thing that we have to think about here. So she is so okay. So the question then becomes, so why is this change? What is this change in view? What does this mean when we look at the feminine? When we look at the feminine monster, and there's like a sexualized component to it, that she's either being punished for sexual behavior or for hubris. For hubris being the word for pride, thinking one is better than the gods in particular. That's like the worst form of hubris. Or is she, or is it just, does it have to do with an immoral kind of behavior? Because that would be an immorality. You don't think of yourself as being better than the gods in any kind of a way, because you're a mere mortal, and they will put you in your place rather quickly. And in the other version, it's almost like she's the model of the temptress. She's the beautiful woman who thinks she's more beautiful than the gods, and and so the gods punish her by, Medusa thinks her hair is beautiful, and so now, now we're going to turn your hair into snakes, and now you're going to be something that when people look on you, they turn to stone, Again, back to the objectification idea, but in a different way. More like, it almost comes more back to the idea of men who fall in love with beautiful women, and then when the woman rejects them, it's just, because they see the woman as an object, they feel like, that's a thing that I want to possess. I'm entitled to possess that, So that's a rather, I don't know whether that's a different attitude from ancient Greece or not, but it's certainly one that comes out in some degree in the later stories. There's also kind of a changing view of the serpent. We start to, especially in later interpretations, because the early Roman period kind of coincides with Christianity and certain forms of Judaism that were a little bit more apocalyptic. And you start to see, you have sort of this negative view of the serpent, In most cultures, snakes and snake mythology, for whatever dangers the serpent may present, the serpent is usually considered to be a positive, life-giving influence. The serpent has to do with time, with the cyclical nature of time, and with life. Life is how it is. And the biblical view tends to view life as a corruption, as something that should not have happened. What goes on in the garden is a sin, and that lust for the forbidden fruit, which is encouraged by the serpent. Okay, so you have this kind of idea. One interesting thing I want to say about that, and again, just sort of going back to the classes I've taught on this, as any university professor, full-time, part-time, whatever, knows, when you're teaching students a subject, particularly when you're lecturing. And by the way, I'm in defense of the lecture. A lot of people will say, no, classes should be interactive, lecture's boring, students don't pay attention. And I'm like, bullcrap. Students need to learn how to listen. People need to learn how to listen in general. It really gets on my nerves that, I'm expected to stand up there and entertain and come up with worksheets for you. I'm like, no, you sit down, you shut up and you listen to what I have to say because I've studied this and maybe you'll learn something. Drives me nuts too when they show up in class and they have no notebook, no pen, no nothing. Like they're not even like their computer to take notes. It's like, and if they have it open, they're probably looking at something other anyway. But how many of them, they don't know how to listen, they don't know how to take notes, they don't know how to extrapolate from what you say. Anyway, why I bring this up is because when I've taught this particular class and I've had students who clearly are just sitting there vacantly and not paying attention, frequently what will happen is there will be a test on the midterm exam. There'll be a test question, I should say. And that question will usually have something to do with the symbolism of the serpent. Okay, because when we talk about water deities, what is the symbolization of the serpent? And inevitably, the ones who have not studied will immediately say, oh, well, the serpent represents evil and the devil, because he tempted Eve in the garden. And that's the default answer. And, while that answer is, at least for my purposes, wrong, it's right in some ways, but it's wrong in the sense of what I'm trying to get them to get to. I say, okay, but I find it interesting because that's the default answer. I don't know the answer. I wasn't paying attention. But this is so I'm going to default to what the narrative that I was taught in my culture. It could have been in my religion. It could have been in my, classes on religion. It could have just been something that I've heard somewhere in the culture if I'm not religious. But people default to the idea of the serpent as in the Garden of Eden, and the serpent as evil, and the serpent is representing the devil in some fashion. So the life force, in other words, becomes associated with the devil. And that's a rabbit hole we could really go down with the idea of life as somehow being a satanic thing. But rather than do that, I think it's just interesting to note the way in which Medusa, she starts out as this one type of creature. And it's not that she doesn't represent a danger, but she goes from being really a divine type of creature, even though she can be killed, to this very powerful creature, to some to either being reduced to a woman who thinks she's just so much better, or a woman who is a victim. I think the other thing I would like to say, and I'm also going to talk about this with the myth of Persephone, which will be the next topic that I cover, is that be very wary of how you interpret rape in Greek mythology. And I might have said this in previous episodes, so I apologize if I'm being repetitive. But it's important because people tend to take these narratives and try to look at them ethically. And I think that's another problem with this one, too. As we get into the Roman period, and the nature of religion is changing, where it's changing from a sort of a trying to listen to, negotiate, and appease and make a pact with nature and the forces of nature, when religion starts to become about a God that will save us, and that thus we have to, engage in some kind of ethics, and we expect the God to engage in some kind of ethics. Then these start to become morality tales. And in the modern world, we tend to look at these stories like, another way that women are subjected through rape. And I'm like, and of course, this is one of the things when people teach classical mythology, they're like, well, the whole rape thing is triggering to people maybe who have actually been raped and so forth. And while that's all understood, that this is how we're reinterpreting it kind of in a modern context, I would suggest be very careful of interpreting rape scenes in a modern ethical sense. Even if you want to look at, even if you're looking at it and saying, wow, that girl was, ravished by that god and she didn't ask for that. You're not talking about the same thing. You're not talking about a relationship between a man and a woman. When you're talking about gods, you're talking about forces. So typically when you're talking about a rape, you're talking about being overwhelmed by a particular force. And sometimes it is metaphorical of the way in which, there is where one is in one state and suddenly taken away to another state that is semi-divine, but that the trauma and the difficulties that this may cause, or what comes out of it, what kind of trouble that might bring, or what kind of good things that might bring too, especially if the result of that is the birth of a hero, for example. So it is generally more representative of something rather than, there's a lot in Greek mythology. There's rape, incest, cannibalism, and all of it has to be taken. You cannot read it. You're making a mistake if you read it ethically, okay? Because, and that's the problem that a lot of people make, because they assume that gods should behave in ethical ways. And I'm like, that's not what the gods represent. That's not how they are. That's not how forces of nature are. They're unpredictable, they're capricious, and they're not about the kinds of rules that we like to set for living in a society. Not that we don't need those rules for living in a society, okay? They're extremely important, okay? In order for everybody to be able to share and to get along, they're extremely important. But they don't have anything to do with the gods. The gods are not, the gods may have their own kind of little code about, what boundaries to set. And of course, if we talked about the Erinyes, they're the ones who kind of, particularly within families, but also supposedly, if you believe Heraclitus, among the gods, that they will keep things within their natural boundaries, at least. The gods aren't going to pick up the sun and throw it somewhere, although at least in one myth, Zeus makes the sun rise in the west. So, that doesn't always happen either, I suppose. But, the idea is that you are dealing with forces that are not, that are outside of your normal kind of social conventions, and the gods may be pleased by something you do one day and not pleased by it the next day, or you may do it and even if it's pleasing to them it may make no difference. So bear that in mind too when we're talking about this, and I feel like the Medusa myth is a good example of how again, it is another example of how the kind of force that she represents, the kind of stultifying or traumatizing force that she represents, how it's become changed into something else when we start moving into more ethical inflections of religion. So that's where I'm going to leave off on Medusa. And again, I want to thank you very much for listening. I thank my patrons. I've had, some new patrons. I've had some patrons who have upped their donations. So again, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. If you would like to become a patron, please go visit Chthonia, patreon.com/Chthonia. Please visit my website at chthonia.net, where I have not only all of these podcast episodes, but also all the projects that I've been working on, including one academic book and some fiction works that are, I'm hoping the one's going to be done by the end of this summer. I'm also planning to put some new classes out that I'm constructing myself. I'm hoping to have those up by the beginning of August. And also visit metapsychosis.com/series/Chthonia if you want to also see this series. And soon, I believe on August 7th, I'm going to be having a mini podcast interview with Marco Morelli of metapsychosis.com, which again, I don't think it will necessarily come out on the 7th, but sometime during the month of August, there will be an official, a bigger kind of launch. We've kind of soft launched Chthonia on metapsychosis, but there'll be a bigger launch later in the month. So look out for that. And also, I'm on social media. I'm on Instagram as Chthonia Podcast, and also on Twitter as Chthonia Podcast, and Facebook as well. I think the only place where I'm just Chthonia is on YouTube. So, so please check me out there. And, we'll talk to you in the next episode.